Good afternoon. I'm Laura Timmerman and the director of the Charles and Gloria Joiners Honors Program here at Southern Wesleyan. Thank you for taking time to join us as we celebrate the work done by the seniors of this honors program. They've completed these projects as a summation of their academic work here at SWU, and we have a variety of topics that are going to be presented today. The Charles and Gloria Joiner Honors Program received its name in 2022 from an endowment from the Splon Family Foundation, naming the program after Dr. Charles and Mrs. Gloria Joiner, two alumni of the university and residents of Birmingham, Alabama. Dr. Charles Joiner graduated from Southern Wesleyan in 1962 and served on the SWU Board of Trustees for 45 years. 23 of those were board chair. Mrs. Joiner also attended many of the SWU events and served the university alongside of him. Eventually, they sent 3 of their daughters here to attend SWU. Earlier this month, Dr. Joiner went home to his eternal home. While many of us in the SWU community mourn our earthly loss, the impact he has had on this campus will be forever remembered. 2 of the students presenting projects today have an additional accolade of being named Joiner Research Fellows, meaning their projects were selected for funding from the endowment due to the scholarly nature of the work, recognizing Dr. Joiner's commitment to academics. Please join me in prayer and the thanks and dedication for this afternoon. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for providing a space where faith and academic excellence are not only valued, but combined in a manner to honor you through gaining a better understanding of the world you created. We also thank you for the example of Christian scholarship set by Dr. Joiner. We pray that you are with the Joiner family and friends as they mourn the loss of a relationship of a loved one. We thank you for the salvation and assurance that we have that we will one day be reunited with other believers like Dr. Joiner. Amen.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donovan Mackey. I'm a business administration major, and today I will be doing my speech on a film analysis titled Love It or Hate It, Marketing Wins. So today's agenda, we're going to actually get into the introduction, which is right after this slide. After that, we'll do the background and the literature review, the methodology behind these findings, the analysis and the results, as well as the takeaways for the near future. So, a lot of this information I got, I'm specifically talking about superhero films because I believe it's a really important topic for all of us to really sit and dive into, because I think everyone knows at least one superhero film that they love. So, focusing a lot on Marvel and DC Comics, and also I got a lot of my information from critics, specifically Rotten Tomatoes, CinemaScore, Metacritic, and IMDb. And the entire thesis behind this whole project is critic reviews can affect the marketing of films in positive and in negative ways. Now, before I get any further into this presentation, I think it's important to focus on marketing and what that means as it pertains to film. So marketing a film, it's very important to bring awareness to your film because actually creating a project is very expensive. It's not a cheap thing to actually come by, so you want to make sure that it's actually beneficial when you're presenting this out to the world, as well as getting the word out, creating a buzz, and the most important part is to be able to reach a target audience. Because when you have a target audience, it is going to always be necessary for these people to come back time and time again. And another important aspect, because it is still a business at the end of the day, is always making and maximizing a profit. If you have all this money and you spend it and you're not getting any return on it, it kind of defeats the entire purpose of spending money on it, as well as getting revenue and reaching your bottom line. So also a few important tips for film marketing would be to help pitch the film, which is taking it to the studio and being able to make sure that they see exactly where that budget's gonna go and how much money they're actually gonna actively give the studio or give the director and their team to make the film. Soliciting the funds, because it's not an easy process to come by. There's a lot of steps into being able to get the money, and gaining interest for distribution. Now, the distribution is going into the movie theaters across the country and also around the world. Now, the impact of the critics, which the entire presentation we're going to focus on seeing if they have a true impact on these films. Now, a lot of these critics are journalists, they're directors, some actors turn critics. We have film producers as well as authors. So with a resume and a list of these amount of people, we can all see that these people focus heavily on the actual making and the process behind filmmaking, and they know when it's wrong and when it's correct. Now, one of the most notable critics would be Robert Ebert, who popularized a term that we all in this room use, which is 2 thumbs up. Now, for Robert, that means that the film was good, they hit all the marks, there was nothing missing, and that was his way of saying that the film did exactly what he expected it to do. Now, also, there are some people who don't fully agree with everything that critics do because sometimes they feel like they're being a little too aggressive and they don't really take into account that sometimes people don't always do everything correct, and it's okay if it's wrong. Now, in an article written by Owen McMullen named "Do Critics Take the Movie Industry Too Seriously?" he states, "Movies can have deep artistic meanings, but they aren't made for viewers to analyze lighting on the actor's face for a 2-minute scene, but rather to provide an escape from the monotony of everyday life." Now, this entire statement truly means that a lot of the moviegoers go to see the film to be entertained, to remove themselves from their everyday life, as he stated in the quote, and they're not necessarily looking at the technical elements of a film, as would a critic and all of the other film producers. Now, since we're done with the background, let's get into some actual juicy stuff. Now, this would not be a business presentation if I did not mention any quantitative or qualitative data. So for the quantitative, we're gonna talk about the top and the bottom rated action films, the budget and the opening weekend sales. And for the qualitative, specifically superhero films and the actual critic reviews behind that. Now, the method I chose was I read more than 120, but I chose to pull it down to 120 films between DC and Marvel films. So I decided to separate them by critic scores, specifically the percentages. So 60 all the way up to 96% are the positive reviews, and 0 all the way to 59 are the negative reviews. Now, I know you see this chart and it's a lot of numbers, but my job today is to tell you what these numbers mean. Now, you see that equation up there at the top. That equation actually says y is equal to 5.738x plus 164.39, and r squared is equal to 0.7669. Now, the regression equation is exactly what I'm going to explain to you right now. So for every $1 million increase in the budget, they can expect an increase in global sales of $5.67 million. Or for every $1 increase in the film budget, they can expect an increase in global sales of $5.67 million. Now that r squared, which is right under the actual equation, that roughly means that 76% of the variation in global sales can be explained by the budget, given that the film is going to be successful, leaving less than a quarter of variation unexplained. Now for the bottom films, we have the same equation, just different numbers. Now this equation says y is equal to 1.0456 minus 0.5187, and the r squared is 0.3854. Now this also means for every $1 million increase in budget, they can expect a global sales increase by $1.5 million, which is obviously significantly less than $5.67 million. Or for every $1 increase in the film budget, they can expect an increase in global sales of $1.5 million. So the ROI is much lower for unsuccessful films rather than the successful ones. Now, this R squared means that 38% of the variation in global, if the films are good or if they're bad. Now, there are a whole lot of possibilities for these equations, but for specifically this topic, this is what we have. Now, this is gonna be a lot more interesting because this is my favorite part of the entire presentation. So, I decided to read 120 reviews of the films, as I stated earlier. So I decided for the top 20, I read over each review, and I tried to see which words were recurring over and over again. So I'm gonna call them buzzwords, so that's what we're gonna call them right now. So, as you can see, we have words like humor, entertaining, dark, ambitious, thrilling, heart, and fast-paced. Now, one really good example of a film that I think everyone in this room knows would be a little film called The Dark Knight. Now, this film came out years ago, and they had a budget of $185 million. But due to reviews calling the film dark and ambitious and thrilling, helped push that $185 million budget and put the film into the $1 billion club, which is not easy to do, but with great marketing and also good reviews, helped push that film into a higher stratosphere than before. Now, another notable film by the name of Black Panther, which came out a couple years ago, with a similar budget but around $15 million more, was a $200 million budget, calling this film humorous, ambitious, and had a lot of heart. This film was also able to be pushed into the $1 Billion Club along with The Dark Knight and other films. Next slide. Now we have to get into the bad, and I so greatly apologize if one of your favorite films is in this list, but I did not do it on purpose. Blame the critics, not me. So, we're gonna see words on this list such as forgettable, flop, loud, failed, cliche, sloppy, boring, and just downright unfocused. So, the first film on here was rated at an 8%, came out about 20 years ago, by the name of Catwoman. Yes, Oscar-winning actress Halle Berry couldn't even make the film any more money than it didn't make. So, the film cost around $100 million to make, but they only made $82 million back. In terms of business, they technically lost $18 million, because even if they got to $100 million, they only made the budget back. They didn't make anything else past that, because making past it is the goal. So, they were $18 million in the red, technically. Now, another notable film, which actually came out around last year, by the name of Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, had about the biggest budget out of the 4 films I've described for you today. Had a $300 million budget. Now, the film only made $476 million, which technically means they only made $176 million, missing about $124 million, and that's how much money they did not make back. Now, the film had a 43%, had a big budget, but it was described as lacking spark, not having a lot of direction, and was just not overall that great. However, the villain was amazing, from what a lot of critics said. Now, the entire point of this presentation is to see if my theory is correct. And from all these numbers and the stats, we're gonna say that I'm right. So, as we can see, whether they're positive or negative, the critics have a very big impact on the way people see these films and how much money they're willing to spend and to actually go out and spend their time and go watch these films. And so for the actual future, what a lot of studios want to probably do is focus more on the actual basics and essence of making a film rather than putting a big budget out there and expecting a return and not focusing on what it truly means to make a film. Now, I would not be able to do this presentation if I didn't have any of my references, so shout out to my references. And you can go to the next slide, Leonard. And I want to give you guys a giant thank you so much for coming out and listening to all of us speak today. And I want to give an even bigger thank you to my advisor, Professor Laura Timmerman, for helping me on this long, long journey to be able to come up here and speak to you today. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for me? Yes.
So there is a connection between the critics and the popularity of the film.
Yes, ma'am, it is.
Okay. Do you personally see that as unfair? Because there are situations in which there were great films that got very poor reviews.
I see it more so as the critics are technically an influence, but they're not necessarily the entire answer. To be able to have these films have the turnout they have. Because I've seen films, from my perspective, I've seen films that are really good, but had really bad ratings. But over time, they've been proven to be good films. They just probably were marketed at a terrible time because there could have been another film that was considered more important that got more of the shine than the film that probably should have gotten it.
So it's all about timing as well.
Yes, marketing is solely about timing because you can market everything together. That's usually why, for example, superhero films, they have such a big gap between each other.
Yes.
And also they do them during the summer a lot because they know people have a lot more leisure time to go and see these films.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Okay, so I noticed on your two lines of best fit, you compared comparison correlations. One was a higher match and one was very low correlation. So I'm curious because on the negative one, there was a low correlation there.
Mm-hmm.
But the marketing was there. So was it the impact was, the marketing was better, so made it positive regardless of what the critics said in the first one, the positive, and the negative, the critics brought it down.
Yes.
Is that it? So the positive really was just because of the marketing, not necessarily the critics.
So it was really the marketing that helped shoot it, but also the critics can help influence it even more. But basically what I was trying to prove was how the budget alone is one sector, but the critics can help add another aspect to it.
And then the only other one I had was, I'm curious because of the terms, like dark. I use that to describe a movie I don't like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and my wife, I went and watched something, my wife said something, that was dark. She did not like it. So I'm curious how that's positive.
Yeah, I was actually reading through them, and from most of the ones, they were for films that had more of a deeper tone to them. Necessarily like the actual cinema of the film, because The Dark Knight does look like a very dark film. Granted, it's henceforth in the name, but sometimes they try to use it in a way to where it described and helped uplift the film, because the word dark is technically a derogatory way of describing something. So, yeah, it was just different looking at the way that certain words can be flipped and used in a positive way as opposed to a negative way. Yes.
So you said you evaluated critic reviews and you compared them to see how they impacted the film's overall net gain or loss.
Yes.
Did you look at pre-screening critic reviews exclusively, or did you look at all critic reviews from any time in the film's history, which, I don't know, I feel like the pre-screening versus the whole audience can almost be a, pre-screening is influential, but post-screening is almost just a reflection of the marketing.
So I really focus more so on pre-screening and like first week, because most people don't always go see a film the first time it comes out. Some people do wait on after, see what the critics say to see, because I didn't use the audience score, which is also another element that I could have used, but that wasn't the true focus. But I did focus more so on pre-critic reviews and also the first week. Any more questions? Yes.
Do you know the criteria to become a critic?
So most of the criteria I saw were people who worked in the actual film industry or people who are writers, like I said, journalists and film producers. So it's really people who understand what it takes to make a film and everything that comes behind it. So most of the critics, I also looked at age. Most of them were past the age of 45. Not saying it's necessarily an age discrimination, but they focus more on people who are older, who've been around longer with other films.
But are they appointed to be critics, or do they just gain notoriety if people listen to them?
It's kind of a mixture of both, because some people talk about it, like nowadays some people talk about it online and then they can become a critic in the near future. But before social media and everything, most people were referenced because they had already worked in the field, so there was someone who would bring them in to help critique the films. Any takers? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Hamill, and today I will be presenting my project, which is a study on turnover and productivity on the micro and macro scale. So to start off, what exactly is turnover? Turnover, or I guess employee turnover, occurs when employees leave organizations. It's labor reduction, basically. It can be either voluntary or involuntary, that is to say, employees getting fired or maybe leaving to find another job. And it's typically used as a measure of human resource performance. Generally, more effective human resource practices will yield lower turnover and vice versa. So as for the effects of employee turnover, it is typically associated with poor firm performance. Generally, if you have a lot of people leaving their jobs, that's typically an indicator of low job satisfaction. High training costs as well are another effect because you have to train people to fill those roles that are now vacant. Reduced efficiency and loss of morale, of course, those are sort of a given. And a lot of sources have found that it is negatively related with productivity specifically, which will be the focus of my presentation here. But the effects vary depending on different factors such as industry, the type of employee, the nature of the turnover itself, whether it be voluntary or involuntary, and what specific measures of productivity are being used. So the goal of my research is threefold. First, study the effects of turnover on productivity on a macroeconomic scale using aggregate data over a 20-year period. Two is to study how voluntary turnover relates to a person's productivity on a microeconomic scale using data that I collect. And three, determine what implications this has for businesses and lay the grounds for future research. So as I mentioned, the first phase of my research was to conduct a sort of, we'll call it a macro study, because it kind of covers the entire US economy. So the goal of this phase was to construct a linear regression to basically show the relationship between employee turnover and productivity over time. And we collected aggregate data from two very popular economic databases over a 20-year period and kind of compiled them together. Our measure of productivity was real GDP per worker. This was calculated by taking the real GDP and dividing that by the civilian labor force to basically give us the average productivity of each person within the economy. And then we had three measures of turnover, which we used as our X variable: layoffs and discharges, quits, and other separations. And then, of course, we would eliminate X variables gradually depending on their p-value, which I won't get into all the specifics, but basically that tells you how much of a variable is chance, and you don't want variables that are just related by chance. You want variables that are accurate. And doing this, we expected to see a robust negative correlation between turnover and productivity over time. Go ahead and hit the next slide. So as you can see behind me, we have two equations. Model 1 used all three measures of turnover. X1 is quits, X2 is other separations, and X3 is layoffs and discharges. As you can see, all but one of them are negatively correlated with productivity, which is within our expectations. Adjusted R squared of 0.387, this tells us that roughly 38.7% of the change in real GDP per worker can be explained by the turnover variables used. Significance of 0.01, again, this is really good. This tells us that basically our correlations aren't chance, that they exist, essentially. Now, layoffs and discharges actually had a p-value of 0.868. This is, I won't sugarcoat it, this is kind of atrocious. It basically tells us that there is a very good chance that the correlation is chance. So for Model 2, as you can see behind me, I removed that variable. X1 is quits, X2 is other separations. As you can see, our adjusted R squared is actually improving. This tells us that now 42% of the change in real GDP per worker can be explained by these two variables alone. So layoffs and discharges were actually kind of hurting our calculations a little bit. Significance, though it was really good in Model 1, it's even better now. And both had decent p-values, but quits was by far the more significant variable towards explaining changes in productivity. Now, I didn't exactly have to do this, but I did anyway. Model 3 uses only quits by itself. Like I said, this was a very, very significant variable, so I kind of wanted to see how it alone affected productivity. And as with the previous two models, it is positively correlated, which was a little bit unexpected. You can see behind me on that little graph, the line is going up. Basically, as real GDP per worker, or as quits increase, so does our productivity measure. And there could be any number of reasons for this, which I'll get into in a minute. Nevertheless, significance was really good, as with the previous model, and the p-value of quits was also really good, basically telling us that the correlation does exist, it's not the result of chance. Next slide. So, in general, we observed that turnover was negatively related to productivity, which makes sense. More people leaving means less ability to produce. Together, quits and other separations predicted about 42% of the change in productivity. This left about 58% unexplained. However, considering the fact that we used aggregate data, which summarizes the entire population, 42% was more than I expected. So quits by itself was the most significant variable, but it did exhibit a positive correlation with productivity. As I said, there could be any number of reasons for this. However, it is likely due to the fact that quits is simply, productivity encompasses the entire population, whereas quits only represents a very, very small percentage. So it could simply be that this variable alone is not driving enough change in the population to be negatively impacting productivity. So as I said, my research was threefold. First was the macro study. Second is what we'll call the micro study. For this, we wanted to do a similar thing, basically create a linear regression showing the relationship between productivity and turnover. However, instead of aggregate data, I used data that I collected through a survey. And then we would also control for some other variables as well to see if these have any impact. Through this, we expected to see a moderate negative correlation between likelihood of leaving and productivity, and a strong negative correlation between likelihood of leaving and job satisfaction. If I hit the next slide. So here's how I collected my data. Basically, I sent out a survey to the general population asking, are you considering leaving your organization? 1 if yes, 0 if no. Respondents were also asked to rate themselves in terms of productivity. They were asked a series of questions related to productivity, which were rated on a Likert scale, 1 to 5. And the total was labeled their productivity self-score. Respondents were also asked a series of questions related to job satisfaction in a similar fashion. The questions were rated on a 1 to 5 scale, and their total was their satisfaction score. These two would be our main X variables, but we would also control for some other factors as well, such as years at the company, generational group, gender, and position in the company. There were a number of other questions on the survey as well. However, these 4 specifically received enough responses in one specific category to be considered statistically significant. So these were our main control variables. You can go ahead and hit the next slide. So I know there's a lot to look at here. I wasn't going to give you 100 billion different equations. Instead, I've given all of you I've given everything on a table here. So we have our productivity self-score and satisfaction score with their corresponding coefficients, and our 4 control variables. So as you can see from this, most variables were negatively related with whether or not somebody would leave their organization. So for example, productivity has a negative coefficient implying that the more productive somebody is, the less likely they are to leave their organization, which again is within our expectations. Same with satisfaction. As you can see, satisfaction score was the only really significant variable based on its p-value up until we hit model 5 and all the other control variables are removed. Then all of a sudden, productivity was the most significant and satisfaction had 0 significance. So this basically kind of told us that productivity and satisfaction were somewhat competing for significance when they were measured together. So what we actually did was we did the same thing again, twice. One with productivity by itself, along with the control variables, and one with satisfaction by itself, along with the control variables. Getting a little ahead of myself because on the next slide, so here is productivity by itself, along with our control variables. As you can see, it's still negatively related with somebody's likelihood of leaving. So basically, the more productive they are, the less likely they are to leave. However, it exhibited very poor significance, and there could be any number of reasons for this, which I will get into more towards the end. In the meantime, it exhibited very poor significance. At no point did it have a p-value of anything less than 0.1, which basically means that there is a very good chance that the correlation was simply the result of chance. And if we look down at the adjusted R, the highest one that we observed through this test was 0.023, leaving almost 98% of the correlation unexplained. Actually, it wasn't even the most significant variable during this test. We actually had this control variable years at the company. It had like one level of significance, but other than that, results were largely inconclusive. Go ahead and hit the next slide. Satisfaction score, on the other hand, again, is negatively correlated to somebody's likelihood of leaving, which makes sense. Somebody who's more satisfied is probably less likely to leave their job. And this one exhibited very strong significance throughout. It had a p-value of less than 0.01 during every single test. None of the control variables really contributed anything. Actually, removing them seemed to increase the adjusted R-squared, meaning that when they're removed, more of the correlation can be explained. The highest adjusted R-squared that we observed was 0.101, or roughly 10%, leaving 90% unexplained. This doesn't mean that our numbers are bad necessarily, it just means that there's a lot of other factors that aren't taken into account with this data set. Oh my. So overall, productivity measures were negatively related to a participant's likelihood of leaving. As I've reiterated many times, our data showed us that more productive or more satisfied people were less likely to leave their jobs. However, satisfaction score was the only factor that could reasonably predict whether or not somebody would leave. This was based on its p-values. Test 3 especially had very high goodness of fit, as we saw through its significance. Test 3 was the one where I used satisfaction by itself. And the control variables had little to no effect. As I said in the previous slide, removing them actually seemed to improve the adjusted R-squared, meaning that when these things aren't taken into account, more of the correlation can be explained. Tests 1, 2, and 3 all had very low adjusted R-squared values. Again, this doesn't mean that our numbers are bad, it simply means that there's a lot of factors unaccounted for. So I'm just gonna kind of reiterate everything that I've said so far, kind of summarize it a little bit. So for the macro study, we observed a very strong negative correlation between turnover and productivity. This was to be expected. Turnover explained roughly 42% of the change in productivity based on the data that we collected. And quits was a significant variable, but didn't drive enough change to have a negative impact on productivity. This is, as I explained before, quits are a very small percentage of the population, so it's likely that it simply just wasn't driving enough change to bring that productivity down. So likewise, with the micro-study, we observed negative correlation between productivity and voluntary turnover. However, the correlation was somewhat weak. This could be due to a number of shortcomings with the research, which I'll get into. However, there was a very strong negative correlation between satisfaction and voluntary turnover with high goodness of fit. This pretty much just confirms what common sense would tell you, that people who are more satisfied are less likely to leave. We did not observe any significance between the control variables and likelihood of leaving. Again, removing them seemed to help more than it hurt. So as with any research, there were a few shortcomings. Mainly for the macro study, it used only aggregate data. Real GDP, as I said, represents the entire population's productivity, whereas turnover represents only a small population who are either getting fired, getting laid off, or leaving their jobs. Most people who are working are still working or are relatively happy with their jobs. So since turnover represents only such a small population, it's likely that, as was the case with quits, it's just not driving enough change for us to see a really strong adjusted R squared. For the micro study, it was very general. Productivity was not necessarily defined. It was more just, since we were marketing it to the general public, we didn't really have an industry-specific measure of productivity. And then, of course, people rate themselves on different scales as well. Two people could be objectively just as productive as one another, but maybe one person thinks really highly of themselves and the other person is a little bit more harsh. So they might be just as productive, but they'll have completely different productivity scores. And since it's all self-evaluation, that's about all we have to go on. The micro study was also a convenience sample. It didn't show us the whole population. It only showed us those who cared to answer the survey. And it also only reflected one point in time. The nice thing about the aggregate data was that it showed us the change in productivity and turnover over a whole 20-year period. I mean, we could have gone longer if we wanted to. Whereas the micro study was just how people felt when they took the survey. And hit the next slide. So some opportunities to expand. Mainly the micro study has a lot of room for improvement, specifically developing a framework for the micro study using objective industry-specific measures of productivity would be a really good start. Basically, for example, if we wanted to send out a survey to like the manufacturing industry, a good way to gauge their productivity would be like, how many things did you make in the specific time? Or like retail, you could ask somebody, how much did you sell? That would hopefully get a much more accurate picture of their productivity. Kind of going off of this, eliminating the personal bias aspect. As I said, a lot of people rate themselves, they might rate themselves really high or they might rate themselves really low, but it doesn't necessarily reflect their actual productivity. So if everyone could be rated according to the same standard, that would hopefully paint a much more accurate picture. And then track each person's productivity over time. Again, as I said, this research it reflected how people felt when they took the survey. But if it were possible to track each person's productivity over a 20 or so year period, that would definitely paint a much more accurate picture of that person's productivity over time. Here are my references behind me, and I would also like to thank Laura Timmerman. She was my mentor for this project. Couldn't have done it without her. So, and I will take questions at this time. Any questions? Yes?
Was there a particular industry you were interested in?
Originally?
Like the economy in general?
Yeah, well, originally we wanted to focus on manufacturing, but we were worried we just weren't going to get enough responses to generate a comprehensive, what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, the micro study focused on basically the general population because we wanted to get enough responses in order to make those calculations. So in order to keep them related to one another, we kind of just focused on the general economy. But manufacturing was originally an industry that I was interested in researching, and if I were to do a future research, I would probably do something like, focus on how much each person makes, maybe, in their specific industry. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but yes.
I think this is fascinating. It's really hard to measure productivity because so many jobs today are difficult to measure because they're not just making a widget or making something, you're oftentimes providing a service. I think it might be interesting, and not to discount the value of what you did, but it might be interesting to look at the cost of turnover to the industry because every industry that experiences high turnover, it's costing them thousands upon thousands of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And that might have been an easier way to get a handle on a number as opposed to productivity. Not that that wasn't important, but
Mhm.
Great job, you did a very good job.
Thank you. Yes.
So this is a question for future, are you going to continue to study this topic in the future?
Well, I'm about to graduate, but potentially, but it wouldn't be as an assignment.
As an employer, my question is, like if somebody were coming in or leaving my company, my question is, what impact do you feel like your job is having on either the community or the world? And do you think that that has a place as a question in this type of study in terms of like, not just job satisfaction, but purpose-driven job satisfaction?
Mhm. Absolutely. Actually, one of the questions on the satisfaction score, which if I'd had the time, I would have gone through all my questions that I asked people, but one of the questions was like, do you feel like your work is meaningful? So I feel like that definitely impacts satisfaction for one thing, but also productivity. Like somebody might be more motivated if they feel like they're making a difference. I know I, for one, do.
Want to stay longer. If they feel like they're making a difference, they wouldn't want to stop making a difference.
Absolutely, yeah. Any other questions? All right.
Hi everyone, my name is Ann Lane, and my mentor was Dr. Stacey Johnson for this project. And my research was finding correlations in lifestyle and the health of the gut microbiota in college-age women. And so this project was done by conducting a survey and analyzing the data obtained from it to find these correlations. So just for a little bit of background, we know that gut health is important and that different variables affect the microbiota and its motility in the gut. We all know that if you eat sugar all day long, you're going to have a stomach ache, but we don't always know why this happens. And so this is because when an excess of anything enters the gut, it's not able to be absorbed as quickly and will affect the digestion and motility of the microbiota. So a good example of this is fruits and vegetables. They're very good for you and contain a lot of healthy nutrients like fiber, but even too much fiber will negatively affect the gut health. And so there's a lot of nutritional research out there showing what is healthy for the gut, and so we want to see the association between these variables. And so we're studying how often someone consumes a certain food and seeing how much pain or discomfort they feel. So there's a variety of research that's been done in the past studying the impact of these habits in athletes or other subgroups, but few have focused on women and their gut health specifically. And so we want to see if there's anything unique about this age group in women. And so one study we found examined dietary habits in relation to weight control and fatigue symptoms. That study was conducted by Yang and Cho in 2013. And so there was many questions from their survey that we used and derived, especially ones about individuals' characteristics and their dietary habits. So for all of us, there are things that make us feel uncomfortable, have a stomach ache, or feel bloated. And so the purpose of this research was to find exactly what those foods were or drinks and to identify them and see just how that relates to healthy gut microbiota through the use of a survey. So we want to investigate the correlations between these gut health issues and the dietary and lifestyle habits that might be affecting them, specifically for female individuals aged 18 to 22 years old. And so we also want to do this to provide helpful information for women to just about how to best take care of their bodies and just learn more about what affects it. We have two research questions. First off, what variables are associated with pain and discomfort? And secondly, how does the microbiota of the individual relate to pain and discomfort? And so we determine this by how much someone consumes a certain food. So this project has been in the making for a little over a year now, and so I have a short little timeline for you. Research began last spring to find relatable articles using a site called ResearchGate. And so with this program, we could see an article that would be beneficial to our research and then everything that was related to it. And so it helped us find our research is much faster. So soon our survey started to be formulated, and as I said before, many of our questions were derived from the survey from the Korean Journal article. And so I also want to note that the article was in Korean, and so through translation, some things might have been missed, and so a few of their questions were tweaked for our survey. A one-on-one Zoom call with me And so they would take the survey and read and answer each question out loud. And so for various questions, they were asked to explain why they answered the way that they did. And so for each of these, notes were taken and reviewed afterwards to see if there was any common trends with how people answered a certain question. And so this was to ensure that each question was interpreted the way that it was intended. And so after making a few changes and tweaks to the questions for clarity, the survey was released to the public to be taken. So it was advertised through flyers and social media, and we ended up with roughly 50 participants for the survey. And so this spring we've been cleaning the data to put it in a form that could be analyzed. And so to do this, we use an analysis software called JMP, or commonly known as JUMP, and was used to find these correlations through logistical regression. So this is an example of one of our questions about the dietary habits of the participant. Many of the questions were similar to this style with like a Likert scale type answer question. And so that way we could easily make the analysis numerical for the software to read. So these are histograms of our food groups. This shows the frequency of each group from our data collection, and as you can see from the key, 1 represents daily consumption while 7 represents never, and so there is this range of answer choices. So in figure 1, we can see the range with the frequency of dairy. From our data collection, most participants said that they consume dairy daily, which makes sense. Dairy is something that is very commonly found in food, and so it makes sense that most people consume dairy daily. And then moving on to the frequency of fruit, most people answered that they consumed fruit over once a week. And then the same with vegetables was daily or over once a week. So moving on to our next set of food groups. So the figure 4 was the frequency of fatty or fried foods. And so this was very commonly for more than once a week that people consumed these foods. With coffee was a wide range, and then of course seafood, not a lot of people eat seafood every single day, and so there was more on the monthly or never range. So we had a couple variables that we wanted to study in particular to study the fiber intake. And so as I said before, fruits and vegetables have a lot of fiber in them. And so these were the 2 variables that we studied for fiber intake. And so we have these 2 scatter plots here for a relationship of pain and fiber intake. And as you can see, these scatter plots are kind of all over the place. There doesn't seem to be a best fit line to go with it. And so for the fruit specifically on the left, our R-squared value came to be 0.147, and our p-value was 0.1274. And so these values are not exactly where we would see significance or a correlation between these 2 variables. And then with vegetables on the right, the R-squared value was 0.047 and p-value as 0.5545. So for the R-squared value, we want it as close to 1 as possible to find a more significant relevance. And so for a value of 0.147 or 0.047 doesn't seem to have a ton of correlation, at least with our specific data collection. And so as you could see from our methodology timeline, we've been analyzing the data this spring. And so we used the JUMP modeling to find those correlations. And so as I've said, one of our main questions was about pain and discomfort after certain foods. And so we would plug in these pain questions into the regression model and look at different variables. And so we ran a number of these regression models in the JUMP software, and there were 3 models that seemed to be beneficial for our research to present today. The first model, we looked at pain and discomfort against just normal health characteristics. And so these variables included BMI, sleep, subjective health status, activity, exercise, drug use, and alcohol consumption. And so this model itself showed a significant relationship between its variables with a p-value of 0.0271. And then the second model we ran products or pain after the products listed against all of the food groups combined. And so this model also showed a lot of significance with the variables including the fruits, vegetables, fatty and fried foods, coffee, and seafood and dairy. And so certain variables showed more of an impact than others, but overall the p-value was 0.001. And so lastly, we ran the pain after products listed against just the fruits and vegetables. Like I said before, we wanted to see this exact fiber intake. And so as I said, there didn't seem to be a big significance with this model specifically. And the p-value for that was found to be 0.2241. So for some next steps, we would love to continue to use this data set for analysis and find just some more significant correlations, and to even go beyond that to find an even larger data collection. As I said before, we found about 50 participants for our survey, and so there are certain things like with the fiber intake, there might be a significant correlation between those two variables, but with only 50 participants, we might not be able to see that yet. But we would also think that it would be very beneficial to study specific numbers for the grams of fiber intake. And so for a survey, all of the answers are subjective. We think that if we had a more objective study, we could see exactly how much of a certain nutrient that someone is consuming. Like for example, you could say that you ate fruit daily, but that will range between people. Like some people may eat one banana, some people may eat a whole spread of fruit. And so that's a definite difference in the fiber intake. So we would love to study the intake of these exact nutrients and determine the biodiversity of the gut. In addition to this, we think studying the subgroups of the foods that we found to be significant would be helpful, and to also find out why certain variables weren't seen as significant. So this is my reference to the Yang and Cho article. Definitely helped me with formulating my survey and finding just questions that would be relevant to this research. And then I'd like to acknowledge my mentor, Dr. Stacey Johnson, for helping me through all of this and figuring out just how to do everything. I'd also like to thank Professor Laura Timmerman with the honors program and Dr. Sun for translating our Korean article for us. I'd like to thank the Charles and Gloria Joyner Honors Program and the Joyner Fellows Program for giving me this opportunity to conduct this research and present it. And of course, the Southern Wesleyan University School of STEM for helping me get to where I'm at right now. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
You talked about dealing with subjectivity on the intake side, but I'm intrigued why you had something that feels to me, a non-scientist, subjective on the output side in terms of pain or discomfort, which could range. Is there a more objective standard you could use on the reflection end or from the jump where you just concerned with pain and discomfort, and that's going to stay no matter what? Is there a more objective way of measuring the effect on the gut than pain or discomfort?
Yeah, I think that I would love to find a more objective variable that could, except for just pain or discomfort, that anyone could feel for any reason. And so as of right now, that's beyond my understanding, but I think that it would be very beneficial to find a more objective variable.
Was that same variable used in the influential study you looked at? Did they ask about pain and discomfort too?
Yeah, so for that study specifically, they were studying fatigue symptoms, and so that's also a very subjective variable for how much fatigue someone feels.
Did you look at probiotics at all in any of this? So, for example, my dairy may be high in probiotics.
Mhm.
I'm having that every day or something. So, is that an outlier? Is that anything that comes into consideration in something like this?
Right, so that definitely is a consideration for multiple of these variables. Right now, we haven't looked specifically at probiotics. One of our questions in the survey was if someone took like vitamins or supplements, and so that's something that we would love to continue studying. But for this research specifically for today, we looked at the food groups primarily. Anything else? Thank you all.
Alrighty, everyone. Hello, my name is Daniel Watson, and today I'm going to be reporting my findings from my honors project in assessment of foster care programs in churches. So for those of you that don't know, what exactly is foster care? Foster care is when, due to a variety of factors, the state has to step in and temporarily suspend the parental rights of guardians, of parents, and remove those children from the household to be placed with a temporary guardian. Relatives are the priority for this, but that's not always able to be the case. As of the most recent data, approximately 370,000 youth were in foster care, so there's a tremendous amount of children in the system, and when they can't go to live with a relative, they have to go to a non-relative caregiver or into a group home. This is a tremendous area of need because there's a lot of trauma associated with foster care. There's mental health issues. It's hard being taken away from your parents. There's a reason you're being taken away from your parents. And as such, this is an area us Christians should care a lot about because we know that true healing comes from God, and we can share that with these children, many of which have been unchurched in their lives. While studying for this project, there were two verses that really just kept laying on my heart that I kept thinking of and that just stayed in my mind. The first of these is Proverbs 31, 8 through 9. In this verse, it seems to me God's telling us that we really are called on to take care of the needy, of those that can't represent themselves, that have no voice. And I feel like foster children are a perfect example of this. They don't have a voice. They don't have a way of fighting for themselves. They need people to step in and take care of them. And then Matthew 18:10, I just love this verse because it shows how much God values children and how they're such a blessing. And these children are suffering. They're really suffering in the system. They need help. And I just have to imagine God really cares about them in a very special, wonderful way, and that he would want us to do justice by them. So for my research, I looked at a variety of sources just to kind of assert where exactly our knowledge of foster care is and see how the Christian impact on the issue is being monitored. The first place I looked is I went to the federal government and I tried to tell what kind of resources they have available, and I came across this report called the AFCARS. It's essentially an annual report the government does to keep track of all the children in foster care in the U.S. states and its territories. It keeps track of children in the system. It lets you know how long they've been in the system, how many placements they've gone through, if they're with relatives, non-relatives, group homes. But something I thought was interesting is it doesn't keep track of what kind of group home. You don't know if they're in a Christian group home. You don't know if they worked with a Christian ministry to get the child into a home. And there's no track of face for the temporary caregivers. We don't know what percentage of temporary caregivers are Christians if we're doing our part for this issue, or if other groups are doing more than we are. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are clear mental health issues, and all of the research seems to show that there is a very strong correlation between being in foster care and suffering from trauma. Depression, ADHD, and bipolar disorder frequently occur, sometimes up to 1,000% of the rate of the general populace in foster care. So they're disproportionately suffering from these kinds of disorders and from these diseases. And while there are approaches to this, a lot of these studies theorize ways of being able to help. Very few of them take a Christian approach to the issue. As we know, healing comes from God and only God, and yet a lot of people are trying to solve this by earthly means, by focusing more on mental health, which is important, but not doing so in a Christian manner. And then there are denominations and other Christian organizations working on this. A great example is Hepzibah 62.4, which is the Wesleyan Church's foster care ministry, their wing for this problem. And the other denominations like United Methodist, Catholics, they have their own groups as well. And there are private Christian organizations. A local example would be Miracle Hill. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that before. But there's not really a measure of seeing how these groups are doing overall. They keep track of themselves and they keep track of the statistics and the kids they're helping, but no one's gone in and looked at, okay, are you doing a good job overall, increasing awareness of the issue? Are churches aware that the resources are available, you offer resources to them? And that's what I sought to really look at for this project. So I decided to do a survey of pastors and just see kind of scout out the general awareness they had for foster care and if they were aware of the issue and knew of the resources available to them. Before I discuss that a bit more, I do want to cover the delimitations of my survey. It took place over a limited time frame, only 2 months. It was a convenient sample. It cannot be considered to be a perfectly representative of all of American society, and it was cross-sectional. Overall, I got 48 responses. 8 of those had to be eliminated due to a variety of reasons. Some were insincere. Others, the person that took it failed to establish their credentials that they were a valid respondent. I wanted pastors for this and only pastors. And then after I got the number down to 40, all of them were good, so I decided I went into Microsoft Excel, I used pivot tables and other features, and I just analyzed the data and tried to see if there were any trends that I found to really stand out. Focusing more on the qualitative side of the problem, so of my responses, 32 were Wesleyan. So this ended up being a very Wesleyan-centric survey. That's not what I was aiming for. That just ended up being the people I was able to connect to due to obviously my connections here at SWU. 24 of these pastors indicated that their congregations had above neutral interest in foster care, which while over half, I did find it highly concerning that 16 pastors would say, no, our church just is not interested in helping with this problem. Only 13 had ministries dedicated to helping with foster care at their churches, and only 18 of the 40 pastors were even aware that their denomination offered any kind of resources. Less than half of the Wesleyan pastors that responded to the survey did not know that HEPZA 62.4 is even a thing. I have just some pie charts up here covering a bit of data kind of describing the sample I was looking at. Most of the churches were small. The vast majority were under 250 people attending on an average Sunday. Most of those were under 100 people attending on every Sunday. Most of the pastors felt that their congregations knew somewhat about foster care, but over a fourth said that their congregation knew almost nothing of it. And then this is also important to remember when considering these results. Almost all of the pastors represented churches whose congregations were primarily white. So this was not a perfectly representative survey of all of American society. It's only a certain section of it. So kind of looking at some of that qualitative data, I decided I wanted to look at how many of these of the churches that had dedicated foster care ministries, were there factors that were associated with it so that we could do something about it. I tested 3 different models. Of the 3, Model 3 ended up being the most effective. It utilized factors from 5 different of the questions I asked. It was able to correctly kind of predict 33% of why a church may or may not have a foster care ministry. It had a significance of 0.002, so it is significant. It's not likely left up to chance. 33% is not a ton. There's obviously 67% that isn't explained, but what this allows us to do is now we know there's still a lot left to be explored in this area, and in the meantime, while we're studying that 67% that isn't explained, we have 33% where we know these factors, we know they're associated with it, or they seem to be, so we can take action in this area and work on improving the life of foster children and getting a greater Christian impact while further research takes place. So looking at that 33%, some good ways, it seems, to increase Christian participation in foster care would be 1, to bring attention to denominational programs, and 2, build awareness in congregations. Not everyone has to be a foster parent to help in this issue. We can all do our part in other ways just by talking with your pastor, making sure that they know that they have resources available, especially if you go to a Wesleyan church. Chances are your pastor doesn't know that they have resources available to them, making them aware of these resources, printing out bulletins, sending something out in the email, just doing anything to increase awareness, build participation is a good thing to do while we continue to study in this area. There were some limitations to the survey. You cannot consider the results generalizable. It was Wesleyan-centric, as I already mentioned, and not ethnically diverse. Future research would definitely want to look at better representing American society. As we all know, the vast majority of Americans are not Wesleyans. We're a relatively small denomination. Capturing the general awareness across the whole country, which was the goal. In order to do that, it needs to actually represent the country. And doing a longer study, maybe 5 years, a longitudinal study could potentially help with this, allow for more in-depth research, allowing for people to really see what that other 67% is, find out why churches don't have ministries or do have ministries. It's just important that we continue to take action in this area. It's critical. Those children are really struggling, and as Christians, it is our job to take care of those who cannot take care of themselves. There are my references. I can discuss any of them if there's any questions, but then thank you. I really want to thank 4 people in particular. One is Michael, because I could not have done my statistical analysis without him. He should be a professor someday. He was so wonderful. I want to thank Dr. Deb, because she did 3 of my honors projects with me while I was here, and I just really appreciated all your help with that. I, of course, have to thank Professor Timmerman, because you kept me going during all this. And then finally, but not lastly, is Dr. Hammond, who helped me so much and helped me come up with ideas, and I just truly appreciate all of y'all's help. Thank you. So any questions? Dr. Deb.
I'm not familiar with the way the Wesleyan Church allocates resources, but when you tithe in a Wesleyan church, does a percentage of those tithes go to that program you just talked about?
Looking on their website, it did not specifically say. I know that they used to have a physical facility, and then they found that wasn't the most effective way of helping in foster care, so they sold that. And I know a large portion of those funds has been what they're using. On their website, they tell you churches that apply can get grants and other financial assistance that can allow them to build foster care ministries. That's how they try to help now. Instead of being an actual home where the children stay, they realize perhaps the best way of approaching this problem is by helping churches all across the country build up these ministries themselves while working with their congregations. Dr. Wilson?
Do you think the reason the pastors are unaware of this, is it because the program that Hepzibah 62.4 is not publicizing it, or is it that the pastors are not reading the things that are being sent to them from Hepzibah 62.4?
That's a great question. For further, if I was going to continue the study, I would try to focus more on that, because for my survey, I honestly didn't expect so many pastors to be unaware of the resources available to them. That was just kind of a checkbox, like, all right, let's see if any of you are slacking, and it turns out most of them didn't know about it. It's hard to say exactly why they don't know. It's not very hard to find. You just look up Wesleyan foster care. There it is. There did seem to be, from the qualitative data, there did seem to be a general lack of interest in this area, and I have to wonder if that's why a lot of pastors haven't put more emphasis on it. Some congregations were very gung-ho about it, but most of them were in the middle or just didn't particularly care at all, and if your congregation's not bringing it up to you, I can see why it would slip out of mind.
The 370,000 number, is that for the nation?
Yeah, so that's for the nation.
How many foster children are there in South Carolina right now, just as a comparison?
It was hard to find an accurate estimate because the data was more dated for South Carolina. DHS doesn't quite report the same way the federal government reports it. I believe it was around 3,800 are currently in foster care in South Carolina. Majority, obviously, from other states.
Were the pastors that you surveyed South Carolina specific, or were they across the country?
We had a broad geographic distribution in responses. South Carolina did make up the most of the largest number of responses, but that was only 9, if I remember correctly. So we did have a wide geographic distribution, but it also was still kind of limited at the same time because all of the responses except just maybe 4 came from the eastern seaboard, states touching in the Atlantic. So we did cover a wide area, but it was East Coast centric.
Why did you pick this particular topic?
It just matters a lot to my family. When I was in 5th grade, my parents decided they were going to foster because we had the resources for it, and then it just ended up playing a major role in my life, and it's a ministry I really care about, and it seems to be one that a lot of people are unaware of the tremendous need that's currently in this area. The people don't realize that that many children have been separated from their parents by the government and that they're in need of homes. Okay, well, thank you all.
Thank you again for all coming. Please join us across the breezeway in 203 for a reception. There's some goodies over there. And a chance, if you have any burning questions that you didn't want to ask, you can ask, or that you've thought of since then. So just thank you for coming, and please join us for the next part.